African Studies Center. I'm an historian and political scientist currently working on the equatorial African region, and that makes me doubly happy to welcome Professor Florence Bernault of Sciences Po. Florence Bernault has been working for many years on the history and culture of the, I would prefer to call it myself, the equatorial region, as it's really focusing on the rainforest region of the Western Bantu cultural area. So basically to the western part of what's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Professor Bernault has been working at Madison, Wisconsin, the university where Jan van Zina was based. She is currently at Sciences Po in Paris, and she has published many books on the culture and politics of the equatorial region, countries like Congo-Brazzaville, Gabon, and she has done research not just on politics, but on many aspects of the culture of this region. Her research is heavily influenced by, I would say, an anthropological lens. And this is indeed, I think, quite necessary, as when one studies this region, one comes across belief systems that are perhaps not often easily understandable for people with a Western background. I know this myself as I am working on a biography of Barthélemy Boganda, the anti-colonial leader of what would become the Central African Republic. And ever since I've been involved in this, I've been struggling a bit with such belief systems. But Professor Bernault is a specialist on this. Today she will speak on obscure capital, which is a notion of wealth built on accumulation and secrecy. Without further ado, Florence, please take the floor. You have at least 40 minutes, and after that, there will be enough time for questions and answers. Please.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Klaus didn't tell you that I think last time we met in Libreville in 2018, it was a lovely meeting, and I was very jealous for no good reason, by the way. But Klaus and his spouse had traveled from the Atlantic Ocean to Lambaréné in the center of Gabon, taking a boat, public boat from there. And I've never had the chance or perhaps the courage to actually do it. And I thought it was a really wonderful adventure. And you have a quick window on the beauty of those rivers in Central Africa. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here at the African Studies Center and also in Leiden, because one of my most cherished memories in my career was to spend 1 year at NIAS, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, which at the time was still in Wassenaar, right next door. So I really spent a wonderful year, and I could finish my book, or at least the first draft of my book at the time. And it's always wonderful to come back here and also see old friends and have really stimulating intellectual exchanges. So I'm going to start, mostly going to use a PowerPoint, and you immediately see that this notion of obscure capital is still in progress. It's a notion that I am building. I worked a lot on suitcases for a while and trunks. And then I started writing a chapter for a book I'm working on some objects in Central Equatorial Bantu-speaking Africa. And again, part of the PowerPoint hopefully will show you how I came to try and build or start building this notion, so I could make sense of what's going on. So Erica, can I just push on the, yes, we had a rehearsal, but as you see, I was perhaps not paying very good attention. What should I push? Oh, yeah. Here we are. Right. So, so this is what I was talking about. In the chapters that I revised not very long ago, I actually decided to change the idea of obscure capital to dark capital. And dark capital was my first choice. And then I thought, oh, you know, dark capital in French, it's going to be capital noir, probably, you know, capital sombre doesn't really work. And I don't know, I feel it is kind of, you know, racializing this thing and so on and so forth. We can leave this question open, perhaps, for the open question and answer later. But I've decided to go back to this notion and unpack this problem with dark capital instead of obscure capital. I'm going to the next slide. Yeah, there's a little delay, so then, yeah. So what I would like to start with is the notion of capital, wealth, assets, you know, whatever the kind of vocabulary we use nowadays to talk about those forms of wealth that are circulating, but sometimes also being immobilized for a while, exchanged, of course, and part of a global market. And I think, you know, economists, political scientists, historians as well, are more perhaps paying attention to the hyper-modern forms of capitalism today. You know, the fact that capital, financial assets are moving extremely fast, they're growing, they have fewer and fewer boundaries and frontiers. And I put an excerpt of this fascinating article that I found online on digital asset circulation. And if you look at the paragraph, you see that, you know, the nature of what people call digital asset, which is, of course, one of the forms of this wealth. Software, photography, logos, illustration, and so on and so forth, metadata. And if you look at the digital asset circulation, you see that the authors use vocabulary such as unprecedented convenience, flexibility for creators and consumers. This mode of circulation breaks the geographical and time constraints of traditional asset trading, allowing assets to be bought and sold on a global scale in an instant. So this is what I think we have, you know, where we feel like we are going to an ever increasing, more virtual, more abstract, you know, more humongous fluxes of those exchanges. And also, I put this graph here because it shows the crypto economy, and to my amazement, the article explains that when it started, when the first crypto money started in 2014, there were actually already a few hundreds of them. And if you look at the number of crypto monies today, it's more than 20,000. I was like, you know, for me, this was really mind-blowing to see those kind of instruments and technologies to, in a way, again, circulate assets. And in this slide, what I would like to bring your attention to is that even when we go to concrete, tangible commodities, products, actually there's a streamlining and a kind of virtualizing of those, very encumbering kind of products that makes the commerce and the exchanges, especially global exchanges of these products, way faster, way bigger, way more rationalized and homogenized than it used to be. So this is a picture of Rotterdam, of course, with those containers. And if you don't know this book, I really recommend it if you're interested in these kind of questions. The Box by Mark Levinson is a fantastic book that traces the history of how international shipping technologies slowly, with a lot of resistance, adopted what we all know today are those 40-foot long rectangular containers. The first ones were actually shipped from New York to Houston in the US in 1958. In the late 1960s, about a decade later, they had pretty much been adopted everywhere. And what Mark Levinson shows is that it completely transformed the maritime and national economies, because you used to have a proximity between manufacturers and industries next to the harbor and ports, which you don't need to have now. You can have production in China and consumption in the Netherlands or France. Who cares? It goes extremely fast. He takes some example to show that a ship goes from Hong Kong to Rotterdam in about 3 weeks and transport about 9,000 of those containers, loaded with more than 200,000 tons of products inside. And if you look at those harbors, and Rotterdam harbor in particular, you see how the unloading of those containers and their stocking in those walls is completely automated. So in these gigantic ships where you have 9,000 of those containers, you need a crew of only 20 people. And in those ports, you don't see any dockers, any workers anymore, because everything is computerized with those gigantic cranes. So it takes about only 24 hours for those 9,000 containers to be unloaded and put exactly where they should be, sometimes to be picked up and put on a train or some trucks and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the ship can load more, go away, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying here is that there's also a tendency for those commodities, in a way, by virtue of containerization, of adopting this kind of very fluid, very standardized, and very, I don't know how to say it, extremely efficient, fast kind of commerce. So, excuse me. Oh, I'm not pushing on the right buttons. No wonder. So I'm going to go right away to the notion that I am constructing and that I would like to propose for explaining what I'm going to show you a little bit later, and also to hear about your comments and your ideas about it. So what I think is that this overwhelming spectacle of very fluid, fast, unencumbered movements of capital and exchanges tends to obscure the enduring role of forms of capital that are perhaps, rooted in more ancient periods or forms or functions, but are still extremely important, both in reality, if you want, and also in people's representation. And for me, this notion can be defined as a more viscous, a more slower, more concrete, I was about to say heavier, state of riches and assets in very material and tangible form. And the idea of a dark capital comes also from the fact that this capital oftentimes takes its value and its function from the fact that it can be hidden for a while, that it has a kind of secret dimension, and potentially comes from criminal sources. So it's very close to, you know, kind of dark side, if you want, of perhaps regulations of the law. And then, of course, it can be either preserved, transported, circulated, hidden in container safes and cash. So when I thought about this notion, a friend of mine who's actually a historian of capitalism, so she knows much more than I do about that, she immediately thought about the idea of the dark web, which I had no idea about before. And I discovered the existence of the dark web, which is actually just the tip of the iceberg here, which is a more criminal, unregulated part of the web to which you can access apparently fairly easily. I never tried, I must say. Maybe I should, but I'm kind of scared. And you know, you need some kind of encryption and so what. And the deep web is more, as I understand it, something that needs some passwords and some, you know, encoding and so on, and so forth. So that could be useful indeed to try and build this notion. So I arrived to this notion and I put it up front, but in fact, I started this research by several years long interest in suitcases and trunks during the colonial period, especially because I could see how some local societies and ritual experts in Gabon in particular had re-engineered, you know, like Western suitcases to use them as reliquaries, ancestral reliquaries. But in the notion I'm developing, I think the idea that dark capital at some point is preserved in containers is really important. And to my mind, containers are really essential to enhance the value of capital, so the one that they, of course, carry, to circulate and immobilize it, and also they realize, if you want, this value by a kind of double movement of hiding and exhibiting. And I'll show you some examples that hopefully will illustrate this idea. A dark capital, in a way, takes some action, if you know, an inert object can take some action, but of course, those containers, as I do in my research in a more elaborate way, are part of course, relationships. It's not the container, it's what people do with the containers and what they contain and so on and so forth. So they indeed play a role when this and dark capital is realized when it is also exhibited and revealed to a large extent. To contextualize a little bit, in case you are not aware, but you might be aware of this trend, especially if you're in anthropology, there's quite a container turn in anthropology and history. It's a recent one But, you know, there's a gigantic literature on the anthropology and history of exchanges, how things move and circulate, how they are transacted, gifted, and I put, you know, a few very classic studies here, both from anthropologists and sociologists like Marcel Mauss, but also historians like Nathalie Zeman-Davis, and of course, Simon Schama, An Embarrassment of Riches about the Netherlands, of course, during modern history. So actually, this literature is a bit dizzying and very intimidating. When you start looking at the anthropology of exchange, it's really incredibly complicated. However, in the last, I would say, just decade or so, there's new attention, not so much to what people do with commodities or non-commodities, things that can be exchanged and things that cannot be exchanged. I'm not going to get into this conversation, or we could spend next semester about it, but more, and not to the people so much that are, again, put into a relationship by this exchange, but by the attention to the vessels and the containers that, again, play a role in a way, shaping those, the value, the behavior of those products. So actually, this is not the first one. This is the earlier one in the next slide, but there was a very interesting special issue by Daniel Lorsmeil, who's a medievalist, an American historian, and Andrew Schreier. I think he is a historian as well. No, he's an anthropologist, actually. The only thing that I wanted to show you here is a very interesting idea that they put forth, that containers isolate, I mean, of course, allow transaction of the product, but also by isolating the contents, they can also immobilize it, and they fold actually the notion of seize action. So transaction is, you know, circulating between trans, and seize action is for them the moment, you know, the genealogy, you know, and the biography of things. If we follow Apadurai and Igor Kopitov, things have a biography, and at some moment they are circulating, they are exchanged, at some moments they are not, and they are immobilized. And when it comes to Africa, actually, the pioneer scholar on containers in Africa is Emily Osborne at the University of Chicago. Emily is a specialist of West African history, and she has an excellent article on how containers in West Africa were impacted by global economies and global imports, and in a way, and to put it simply, how organic ingredients and the organic nature of most of those vessels, including iron pots and things like that, were more and more replaced by fossil fuels, technologies. As you see, aluminum cooking pots here, but also plastic, which comes from oil, and really proves her point. And then a little bit earlier, actually, I don't know how to, yeah, well, it's in the, I don't know this journal very well, but a special issue put together by Clapperton Mavunga, Jeroen Couvelier, and Catherine Pieper, also was about, as you see, containers, carriers, and vehicles, a little bit more focused on mobility, and trying also to put the perspective upside down and look at African societies and African individuals, not so much as users and people who reappropriated Western techniques, but engineered them on their own, and sometimes also influenced global trends. So this is a river I was talking about. It's not the Uruguay, it's Nguni, but it could be. So what I'm going to do now is try to historicize my hypothesis, which is that in the emerging of dark capital, of what I call dark capital, the history of containers is essential to retrace, and especially that of linear containers. Linear or angular containers, you know, those rectangular or square boxes, trunks, crates, and so on and so forth. Why is that? Because actually, prior to the 15th century, in Central Africa, in the Atlantic Central Africa, as far as I know, but maybe I'm missing, I might very well be missing some points, there were none or almost no rectangular linear containers that were used. See, just a reminder that Portuguese sailors arrived at the mouth of the Congo River in 1483, started some diplomatic and commercial relations with the Kingdom of Congo. The Congo sent many emissaries, ambassadors. The son of the King of Congo became himself a bishop and served in the Vatican for a while. And I love this engraving, which is actually a European engraving because it's one of the few engravings where you see actually the Portuguese emissaries, just sort of throwing themselves on the ground out of respect for the King of Congo. So those relationships were very important. They quickly led to the beginning of the slave trade, leading a little while later to the collapse of the Congo Kingdom, the king being unable really to protect not only his people, but also ambitious rivals to take advantage of the slave trade, to form their own kingdoms and polities. So probably starting in the 15th and 16th century, some of those linear containers probably arrived on the coast of and in the interior of this part of Central Africa. So those were the kind of ships that were used at the time, carracks. And actually, that's the question I haven't solved yet. I need to really talk with colleagues, historians from the earlier period, 14th and 15th century. If you look at these engravings that date from the 16th century, you see that there are very few actually angular containers. It's mostly bundles, of course, barrels. And here and there you see one, but on the other hand, I found evidence, and I think it's probably true, that there were some linear crates like that. They were called nail crates in the medieval period. And this beautiful box here is a Spanish medical box that probably had some medicine and some, surgical instruments. I'm sorry. And so some of these commodities, some of these imports, and some of those containers were probably a little bit different from what existed in local technologies. Now, as far as we know, as I said, the containing or containerizing technologies in Central Africa were very rich, very advanced, including iron smelting. As a fine pipe here, there were some cooking pots produced, of course, the iron was mined as well as copper in Central Africa and smelt in Central Africa. And, you know, the usual baskets, fabric, pottery, calabashes and gourds, leather pouches, beautiful woven raffia, the raffia palm tree fibers. And one of the early visual evidence that we have of the Kingdom of Congo by a Capuchin monk, Cavazzi, in 1687, in this picture, shows this character here is showing textile, probably luxury textile, from a box that looks a bit angular, but looks a little bit more like a basket, like a woven basket. So I had to talk with colleagues once again I mean, even if they were angular or linear containers, I think they were probably fairly marginal. So with the Atlantic trade and the slave trade, I'll come to it, of course, not only containers were different and became more and more different, because clearly 18th, 19th century, the crate become more and more prevalent in the shipments. But also, you know, and it's simplifying a bit, it's more complicated than that, but there are elements of accumulation. So those products are often very cheap products that are sent to Africa: soap, gunpowder, cartridges, blankets, pearls, and their value comes from accumulation. And you might know that accumulation is one of the characteristics of capitalism. And to go a bit fast, so this is a soap factory. To go a bit fast, anthropologists and historians tend to contrast the logic of accumulation in the formation of wealth with that of composition. In Central Africa, composition, that is specific putting together of different objects with different values and of course, how to say that, values that go together, right, is something that you find actually not only in the making of therapeutic charms or divination charms, like these chokwe divination baskets, and this is a description, of course, very derogatory description of, you know, the kind of what the typical colonial or European writer would say at the time, you know, this kind of, sorry, I think there's a, well, actually, there's not too much of a derogatory term, but, you know, he talks about palm fiber cloth, pipe clay, pepper, aromatic powder, a horn, some feathers, tassels, dried chameleon, and so on and so forth. And that was, of course, based on the knowledge and expertise of ritual specialists who knew how to compose those charms. And the charms themselves were, in fact, also a medium to communicate with the world of ancestors and spirits, and put into action some circulation also with this realm. Also, this is actually a good illustration of the more rounded organic, perhaps nature of those containers in the 19th century. In this part of Equatorial Africa, but not everywhere. It's true in Gabon. If you go to neighboring Congo-Brazzaville, you won't find that. It's very frequent that societies in Gabon had a cult for ancestral relics and bones that they composed into those reliquary boxes, and you might be familiar with the beautiful fawn statues. And usually you just see the statues, but in fact they were only one element of those reliquary boxes, oftentimes with, in particular, part of the skull of very important people. Not everybody was, of course, in those reliquaries, but they were always prepared with some ingredients in those reliquaries. So you see those two logics coming together and clashing to some extent, but in fact, they were also the coming of sacred and ritual objects since the end of the 15th century in the guise of Christian Catholic ritual objects. And in those incredible visual sources, this time for Dionigi Carli and Guattini, the mission of the original is in Italian and is kept at the public library in Turin. You see that the missionary, this is the caption here, the missionary father travels in the country with Negroes from the hospice carrying all these things, i.e. a portable altar. And a portable altar is something that I was super interested in because I found it in the 20th century as well, the missionaries who came later, much later with colonialism. And if you look at the illustration, you see that you don't see the altar, you see some boxes and crates, right? So perhaps this one, perhaps that, probably angular, if we believe this other picture where the altar is actually open. And the caption here explains that the missionary in open countryside is administering baptism to Congolese Christians, and so on and so forth. So there's a logic of accumulation, but there's also the coming of objects that for the Congolese Christians were also of extraordinary value, and also in a way preserved, carried, and then exposed in those crates and boxes that were quite a bit different from their own organic rounded form, or at least not very angular. The other thing that I found, and I have a bit of a hard time finding a lot of evidence about it, but I think I'm not just looking at the right place, is something that is described by Franco-American explorer Paul Duchaillu in 1867, what he called in the first edition in English, slave bundle, which is a parcel of goods that is composed, that amounts to the value of a slave. So it's a kind of, the market sort of dictates that in this bundle, you would have so many yards of textiles, so many gunpowder, so many mirrors, so many whatever, which actually is composition rather than accumulation here. So I'm not sure what to do with it. But in the French edition, it's not really a bundle. He calls it a caisse, and a caisse is really, in French, it's a wooden crate. Or coffre de traite, and coffre de traite, I'm sure I've seen it elsewhere, but I have a bit of a hard time finding more. So these coffres were probably really something quite frequent in those caravans where they were, this sort of set, already prepared set of objects. not visible because they were in a crate, that would be exchanged for the life of somebody who's in turn objectified, right? So there's already this idea that this kind of wealth, inert, preserved in crates, can actually equate the value, the life value of a person, and probably gives it, or left, that's my hypothesis, I cannot really prove it in a way, left some kind of, you know, an aura of foreignness, of destruction, of course, and of kind of, you know, social death and very mortiferous meanings. By the way, in some archives, I found coffres de traite mentioned in the marriage payment of the daughter of what they call a chief, a local ruler in Gabon. So it looks like it has diffused, but I don't know much more than that. If we move to the 19th century, the presence and diffusion and penetration, I'm sorry to use this very colonial term, it's kind of convenient in a way, arrived in much larger numbers. In the caravans, explorers were carrying many, many things. There's a very interesting history of those explorations by anthropologist Johannes Fabian, Out of Our Minds, if you're interested in these questions. At the Tervuren Royal Museum near Brussels, you find those trunks. For instance, here, Emil Storm. You find them pretty much everywhere, and they were really a kind of fixture of those explorers. But if you look at what happened between the 1840s and the 1870s, local trading networks in Gabon were totally displaced and marginalized and destroyed by the coming of foreign commodities, by the fact that they could be brought en masse by ferries, by steamboats inside the rivers, that they could be preserved in those factories, those kind of trading buildings all over. This is Lambaréné, by the way. This is where class tourist boat, not at the time though. And in those factories, they play a huge role, also a huge political role, to capture the working people during the colonial period. Most of the commodities were preserved in crates. They were, it was very desirable. Commodities very hard to buy, come to, and then you see here people bringing hundreds of ivory tusks to exchange for those commodities. So you have a kind of quantitative and qualitative sort of flooding of this colonial and imperial economy in this region, and there's a lot to say about new consumerism, again, the kind of capture of local consumers, and so on and so forth. But even at that time, excuse me, there's also a behavior and a technique that's used by explorers in particular, and so-called anthropologists at the time, like Émile Tordet, who worked for the British Museum, was sent to what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo by the British Museum, to dazzle the natives, to bring those, contraptions, phonographs, music boxes, electric machines, that for them they would, unpack, demonstrate, pass them for magical things, demonstrate the kind of technological superiority of the West. And again, some of the best pages are both in Brian Larkin, who coined the notion of colonial sublime, and Johannes Fabian in Out of Their Minds, where he talks about that. Just to give you another sense of how it works, you see again Émile Tordet, the man who was hired by the British Museum, demonstrating a mechanical elephant in the Congo. And I took that from a recent and great article from Rebecca Shepherd on this kind of confrontation. So there's an idea of extraordinary, almost spiritual value of what was enclosed in those crates, not just desirable commodities, quantities of them, but also these contraptions. The last thing that I want to mention is that I found also, I don't know what time a lot, should I wrap? I'm almost there. I found a lot on how money, colonial money, was actually sent to outposts in the interior. And of course, it's a double movement, because the first thing that colonialists do is to collect taxes. Oftentimes it's in kind, because I'm sure Das can confirm, up to at least the mid-1930s, coins and money is extremely scarce in the colonies, and it's on purpose. So you have to work to go to the factories in your own, camp or plantation or timber camp, and you have to take the products that are at the factories. There's no free market for labor. In any case, I found some evidence, some description in some reports of the ways in which, fresh kind of cash was sent to those outposts. They were usually in small wooden crates. They were put in sealed cotton bags. That was usually sealed, perhaps with a lock, I'm not sure. And they were put into safes at the colonial outposts, and sometimes with a guard, actually. So, and this is also something that I find fascinating. There's not many studies about it. It's tax tokens. Up to the 1930s, when you paid your taxes in kind or in cash as a local person, to prove that you had paid your taxes, you had to carry and sometimes to wear as a necklace these tokens, which is a kind of quasi money, which I find really fascinating on its own, because it also resonates with the slave trade very much, and also this kind of bizarre monetary economy that was so predatory, I think, for local societies. So what you have here is colonial monies that are totally monopolized, or almost totally monopolized by white people. And again, everything is it's a spectacle, right? To see those things circulate in the hidden and being protected, and in ways that were very different from monies that, of course, existed. The deep history of local monies. And the last thing that I just want to throw there is the mandatory use of coffins for burying deceased people, starting in 1881, and segregated cemeteries, which also was quite different from the ways in which most societies buried their dead. They certainly did not use coffins. They did not put the body in a coffin. In the Congo, they wrapped the body in textile. or they could expose the body, they could do many things, but certainly not put them in a wooden coffin. Trunks and suitcases, of course, became really a marker of colonialism. So if you look at this picture, you see, which dates probably from the 1950s. And you see those suitcases and metal trunks actually diffused and being adopted quite widely by the colonized. So this is the 1950s, I think this one as well. You see how those metal or wooden trunks served as furniture. This was actually the same in colonial white households. And sometimes, you find some photographies that suggest, I'm not sure it's completely true, that this was also kind of fashion kind of object, like this young couple. And I have a lot of evidence, oral and otherwise, of how people use those suitcases. However, as I say, I think that those linear containers did retain some of their nefarious aura, and especially this idea of a dark capital that sort of depends on what I call life value, so destruction or the procreating of life. And I want to just read you a short excerpt of a discussion I had with a Gabonese anthropologist in the spring of 2023. So I stayed a few weeks, 3 months in the Congo, and I presented my research. And then anthropologist Emmanuelle Nguema Minko told me the story of her grandfather. Minko Nguema, who was born in 1914, then worked in coffee plantations in northern Gabon, and then fell ill around the year 1932, 1933. He returned to his village in northern Gabon, and there, and actually the pattern is something that's not exceptional. He had a dream of a white lady visiting him and bringing with her a magical trunk. And in French, when Emmanuel told me, it's a canteen. It's not at all the same in English, I think, like a metal trunk. And she opens the metal trunk, and Minko Nguema saw that it was full of black and white babies. And the lady announced that now Minko Nguema had the power to put children in the womb of women. And he started a new activity as a ritual expert and therapeutic expert to help women with fertility. But his entire entourage and customers knew that he had this magical trunk. And then I asked Emanuela, did you see the trunk, etc., etc. She said, no, but you can't. It's a mystical trunk. It's not here, it's, elsewhere. But I found it really amazing. And we can also talk, of course, about wombs as containers and so on and so forth. So dark capital and the nefarious aura of suitcases came to me precisely when I was arriving and landing in the airport in Libreville, and I was taking pictures of suitcases, my obsession at the time. And then I was chatting with a lady next to me, and I was surprised because you couldn't see really suitcases. You kept seeing, those big black, like, I don't know, plastic or polyester bags. And I said, well, this is really the fashion of the day. Nobody uses suitcases. And then she said, yes, you know what? And people here, they call them coffins. I was like, oh my God. I was amazed by this thing. And I thought, well, to me, again, it sort of alludes to the potential very negative, very mortiferous aura of those luggages. And in the last few pictures, I think nowadays, it's not entirely true, but very few people have suitcases, actually. They mostly have those bags, which apparently have also a fairly negative aura. Oftentimes you see suitcases or modern, I think this is more like a cosmetic suitcase, used in local rituals and therapeutic techniques, such as in this Bouete ceremony, where you see bags, you see a number of containers, but you see also how charms, the Bouete charms here, are exposed. And I asked a practitioner initiated in Bouete, and he told me that we use them as any other containers. We clean them like any other containers when they are contaminated by the power and the force of those charms. But I do think that there's a particular proximity, or lack of better analysis, between those linear containers of foreign origin and extraordinary value or potency or agency, perhaps, of objects. And in the dissertation of Maxime de Formanoir at Leuven, in southern Gabon, you see also in this kind of altar how often those metal suitcases or trunks are recycled also in this more sacred, spiritual, therapeutic realm. Then, after I left Gabon, and I did that on purpose, I really didn't feel like staying for the elections. Perhaps I don't know if you heard about the coup, the military coup, the day right after the result of the elections were given. The police and military immediately came to the headquarters of the son of the president, and they uncovered those suitcases and bags with enormous amounts of banknotes. So I have a 20-second, we'll see if it works. We had some, yeah. Oh, it does work. Just, it's a bit clearer than the we don't see it here, but there's also a safe that they open, a very modern safe. People were incensed, they were furious, and the way they talk about it is that this is stolen from hospitals, from the possibility of having public, services and health systems. So again, it's like, you trade this enormous amount of cash against the public good. So I just close, huh? Eureka. What I'm fascinated here is the exhibition. There's an element of obscenity. And etymologically, the word obscene is very interesting. It's to show things that should remain hidden. So they are really exposed in front of the Gabonese. I'll just not do that. And a few weeks ago, an anthropologist, a friend of mine, sent me the discovery of a suitcase in an abandoned house with relics, which actually is not that surprising. It's, again, this sort of recycling of modern suitcases for reliquaries, and that helped during the colonial period people to escape attacks from colonialists who, if they found bones in your house, is something that I showed in my previous work, you could actually be sentenced to death under the accusation of just remain seated cannibalism. The French interpreted the presence of bones as the fact that supposedly you unburied the dead and ate them. And there's also buckets here with charms. We don't see it. So this is the end. I'm just sort of repeating myself about this dark capital.
Because I would like to.
Yeah, we just
reserve some time for discussion.
So the things that I just want also to put here is the fact that it can be interesting to use the notion by Anne-Laura Stoller that she developed in a very interesting article, also citing Edward Said about cultural archives, that some legacies in the form of objects, but also of mechanism, perhaps we could say dispositif, continue today in our life in the West, in Africa, in former colonized countries, to carry relationships and racializing and segregation and violence because they still exist. And I think we could actually look at those suitcases and linear containers as imperial debris. Now, I just want to conclude on, we were in Central Africa. This is where I constructed this notion. Is it useful for Western societies? So I think when it comes to, secretly tangible riches, the golden bullions in New York City, those Federal Reserves, the faint taint of criminality and so on and so forth, perhaps we can see it. But what do we do with life value? And the last thing, my very last, I promise, slide, I'll just put it to you with those two newspaper news that I think just perhaps speak for themselves. The fact that today suitcases, trunks, and other containers are often the place where migrants, refugees try and pass borders, and oftentimes paying with their life actually. And I think it could be interesting to talk about it. I have a conclusion. Do you allow me? Sure. I forgot about this one. Well, anyway, the only thing that I want to say is how the past and faraway places can help to perhaps highlight Western patterns, and that when I talked about dark capital, I felt like it was a bit risky, but I didn't want to just stay at the history of linear containers, but try to put together a notion that can be analytical and critical and help us try to see if it shows us something that we don't necessarily see in everyday life, and can be an explanation or the beginning of an explanation. That's this. Thank you very much.